Just 10 miles from where Derek Chauvin is on trial for the murder of George Floyd, another black man, 20-year-old Daunte Wright, was killed by a police officer who claims she mistook her gun for a taser during a traffic stop. And recently surfaced body cam footage shows a black and Hispanic Army lieutenant fearing for his life while being pepper sprayed by police in Windsor, Virginia. From deadly and dangerous traffic stops to deadly racial profiling. Today, we are asking when, if ever, will the policing of Black Americans be fair and equitable? All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report.
Officer Kim Potter, a 26-year veteran of the police force in a suburb outside of Minneapolis, shot Daunte Wright during a traffic stop. Now, she claims that she mistook her taser for her gun. According to New York Times, at least 15 officers have mistaken their guns for tasers in the last 20 years, but only 3 were convicted of any wrongdoing. Now, Officer Kim Potter is being charged with second-degree manslaughter. She since has resigned from her police position at the Brooklyn Center Police Department, and some are asking, are these charges enough? And is holding one police officer accountable going to change how blacks are policed in America? Here for my leadoff panel are Bernarda Villalona. She's a former homicide prosecutor, and now a defense attorney. Also joining me is Sean Michael Smoot. He is a member of Obama's 21st Century Policing Task Force, and he is an expert on police use of force. They are both returning to the program. Thank you so much, Bernarda and Sean, for joining me this morning. Sean, I've got to start with you. Help us understand what happened in the case of 20-year-old Daunte Wright. We're going to put up some videotape of that traffic stop involving this 26-year police veteran, and walk us through what we're witnessing in this traffic stop. Let's play it again. I want to make sure you can, help the viewers understand. It's graphic. People may have seen it. I know a lot of people say they can't watch these videos, but I think we need to have a understanding of how this alleged mistake can happen from an officer that is so senior.
Well, it is hard to explain, and let me just, it's hard to watch. And my heartfelt condolences go to Mr. Wright's family. I did not see anything and reviewed not only the video you just showed, but also a number of different angles of the video that have been played on other media outlets in slow motion and fast motion. And there's no justification for the use of deadly force in this particular situation. As you noted at the setup, this has happened before. It's actually a very, very small percentage of the time that it has happened. I think the most infamous case probably occurred close to 20 years ago in the San Francisco area, in the BART station, where an officer mistakenly used a firearm when I believe he at least stated that he intended to use a taser. Since that time, the training has changed. The positioning of tasers as a weapon on the officer's uniform, on their tool belt, has changed. But training isn't always perfect. And as we saw here, an imperfect action by the officer certainly led to a tragedy for him and his family. And ultimately, I think it'll be a tragedy for her.
Yeah, Sean, you mentioned that case in Oakland. You're actually talking about the Oscar Grant case. Actually, later
Yes.
we're going to be talking to Wanda Johnson, Oscar's mom. She's a friend of the show. She's been on many times helping us understand the trauma that families experience when they have, a loved one that's killed by police. But I want you to focus on just the mechanics, because those of us that don't work in law enforcement don't exactly know, what a taser looks like versus what a service weapon that an officer carries looks like. And we're asking, could they be so similar that someone could confuse them? That seems to just defy logic for most people.
Well, I know that there have been a number of studies done, and even officers blindfolded, 100 times out of 100 could tell the difference, because a firearm, a particular loaded firearm, has far more weight to it than a taser does. The taser is a very light weapon. Tasers are carried, if they're carried under the manufacturer's recommendation, tasers are carried on the opposite side of the officer's body from where they carry their firearms. So normally there's a cross draw. So if you're right-handed and you normally would draw your firearm with your right hand, the taser would be carried on the left hip. So that it's a different motion, it's a different action. In some cases, even officers draw with their non-dominant hand and then switch over with the taser. Based on the video and the audio portion, if you didn't have any video at all and you only had audio from this, you would assume that she was using a taser. The officer announced taser multiple times. She gave the warning, taser, taser, taser. That's part of the training, so that not only to tell the person that they're going to be tased, but also to alert other officers in the immediate area that a taser is going to be deployed, so they're not, accidentally affected by that. And so if we didn't have any video, this would have been certainly would have thought it was a taser deployment. For whatever reason, the officer drew her firearm and pointed her firearm, not a taser. And can it happen? Obviously, it can. There have been some tragedies, and I'm glad to hear that you're going to have Reverend Wanda on later on. I've done some work with her. In fact, she's done some work with myself and one of my partners in Minnesota, and so I have a lot of respect for her and her work in the aftermath of her tragedy. So
I want to get you in here, Bernarda, to talk about what we saw right after the shooting by Potter of young Mr. Wright. Just an unthinkable tragic. We've seen those pictures of him holding his baby. One looks like they're at a birthday party in the backyard. Just a handsome young man. Obviously, so much living ahead of him, and now that's been cut short. We saw the former police chief, who has since resigned, come out immediately to say that this was an accident. Do you think that was the right thing to do by this police chief or former police chief?
So, Areva, this former police chief, let me just say that it is unprecedented that a former police chief or the police department release body camera footage before a complete investigation takes place. And the reason why is because they still have to interview witnesses. They have to interview the officers. They have to conduct their own investigation, and they don't want to tailor the testimony or the interviews of any other witness by putting the body cam video out there for the public to see. However, the chief of police did acknowledge that he felt that it was necessary in this case in order to keep the calm in this case. Now, the mayor has already assured us, and he said that he's going to do everything he needs to do to make sure that justice is done in case. But I will tell you this, Areva, I am sick and tired of being sick and tired. I mean, at what point is this going to end? I looked at that police stop, and I have several questions. First off, why were you stopping him? For an expired registration, which we know based on COVID that it's taking a much longer time to renew that registration? And how did you even see that registration sticker from your view inside of a police car? But aside from that, I understand the chief of the police is the one who said she accidentally took her taser. That did not come out of her mouth. That is an assumption that the chief of police was making. But my focus more of is why did you use the taser? Decide that you needed to use a taser because the circumstances didn't call for it. Mr. Wright was unarmed. armed. He was not a threat to the police officers or to anyone else in the area. So that is my problem. I have an issue with the taser, her saying, the chief of police saying that she confused it because a taser and a gun, different color, different weight, different feel, different positioning. You're 26 years on the job on a daily basis. You got to put your gun in your holster as well as a taser. Don't tell me that now, 26 years later, you just had a blind moment.
Yeah, you raised so many good points, Bernarda, particularly around this notion of why even use this level of force for a traffic stop. They obviously knew where this young man lived. They had his license plate. They could have sent him a citation to his house. They could have, gone and knocked on his door even if they chose to do so. So, Sean, I'll ask you as a use of force expert, how are police trained? Like, why in a routine traffic stop? And we saw the first officer trying to handcuff him. She comes up on the scene and seemingly kind of inserts herself in this situation. Mm-hmm. Why would she even come, with this attitude that she needed to tase him when it didn't even look like to me she had enough information to be making a determination about that level of force? And why, again, in a routine traffic stop would a taser even become an issue for an officer?
Well, so first of all, I don't think we have all the information, and so I can't say what was in her mind. You're asking the same questions that I asked when I viewed the video, in terms of from the officer's video perspective, why she approached, why she attempted to put hands on at that time. Those are good questions. I don't know the answer to those, but my understanding is that this traffic stop escalated to an arrest because the officers may have gotten information that there was a warrant out for Mr. Wright. I don't know that, but that's been reported.
Well, let me ask you this, Sean.
That they may have been trying to take him into custody on that warrant.
Let me ask you this, Sean. If they found out, and again, this is based on your experience as a use of force expert and looking nationwide at what a reasonable officer would do, we know the Graham v. Connor standard that officers should be using when applying any level of force. If that warrant was for a misdemeanor, failure to appear at court or some other kind of misdemeanor, would that warrant, again, retching up this level of force, even if the person has a warrant out?
Well, that's two different questions. The first question is it appropriate to effect an arrest on a warrant? And even a misdemeanor warrant, yes, it's appropriate to effect an arrest. But any use of force should be reasonable, and more than reasonable, it should be proportionate.
Yes.
And in this case, as I said at the outset, I didn't see anything in this video that would warrant the use of deadly force or even the use of serious force. At the time, it escalated too quickly, in my view, on the part of the officers. It was just contrary to what the best practices are and what we're teaching officers now, in terms of de-escalation, slowing things down, creating space and distance, et cetera. This was a totally different scenario.
All of those. Yeah. It seems when you talk about de-escalation, slowing down, creating distance, seems like all of those things were, the exact opposite was done. Let me ask you this, Bernarda. We know this week charges were announced by a nearby county prosecutor that has taken over the investigation, and it looks like second-degree manslaughter at this point are the charges. We've heard from the family and other members in the community that say they don't think these charges are enough. You are a former homicide prosecutor. Do you think the second-degree manslaughter is the right charge?
So based on the video that we have right now, I think that for now, the best charge is the second-degree manslaughter. We know second-degree manslaughter carries a maximum of 10 years. So with the second-degree manslaughter, it takes into account that Officer Potter, that she took a conscious risk. And when she took that conscious risk, it actually led to death, and it was unreasonable. But I'm going to take it a step back. So my thing is, from watching that video, you saw that the African-American police officer had Mr. Wright under control. He was not combative. He was not armed. And that African-American police officer didn't ask for the help of Officer Potter. It was Officer Potter who actually, based on her experience, from her unconscious bias, from her Caucasian background, to her may have felt that Mr. Wright was a threat. And because she felt, based on her scare, that Mr. Wright was a threat, she decided that a taser would have been appropriate in this matter, which goes to show you this is a prime example where it makes a difference when you have an African-American police officer and a Caucasian officer. The threat that the African-American police officer saw wasn't to the point that he needed to, one, ask for help, or two, take out his own taser and shoot electric waves into the body of Mr. Wright.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting when you look at the video and you watch the other two officers, particularly that African-American officer. It's almost like this look of, oh my God, what just happened? He seemed, completely stunned by the turn of events. We've got to move on. I want to ask you, Sean, about, the Army lieutenant who's driving along a dark road in Windsor, Virginia. Again, routine traffic stop about some missing license plates or registrations or something, again, escalates to this poor lieutenant who's serving his country being, totally disrespected, pepper sprayed by this out of control officer. Let's take a look at some of that video.
Get out. Please relax. Get out of the car right now. Now. This is not how you treat a vet. I'm actively serving this country, and this is how you're going to treat me. Back up, Daniel. I didn't do anything. Back up. Whoa, hold on. Daniel. What's going on? Hold on. Watch it. Get out of the car. Get out of the car now. That's fucked up. Get out of the car now. Sir, just get out of the car. I'm trying to breathe. Get out of the car now. Get out. Please relax. Get out of the car right now. Now. Not how you treat a vet.
Disturbing things about that. Not to mention that, a gun is pointed at him by this other officer. This out of control road cop is spraying, gas in his face. There's this exchange where the lieutenant says, "I'm afraid to get out," and he says, "You ought to be afraid."
Right.
What should have happened, if anything, in this kind of traffic stop?
Well, first of all, Lieutenant Nazario, I think, acted in a perfectly reasonable and really perfect way. He was being stopped. He didn't know what he was being stopped for. He got to a safely lit area. He immediately rolled down his window. He put both of his hands out the window. He posed, he showed that he was posing no threat to those officers. He was, acting very intentionally. Frankly, most people wouldn't have the
composure and calm.
The composure to do that. Yeah, thank you. Really, I think. He did everything right in this situation, including, by the way, articulating to the officers, "Hey, I'm afraid to reach for my seatbelt." When they were telling him to get out of the car. Again, you had a situation here too. Really, you had two different police officers as well. I think we don't see the entirety of the interaction there, but you had a younger officer, I believe his name's Crocker, who was actually much calmer and was attempting to kind of de-escalate things and talk to Lieutenant Nazario. And you had an older officer who I believe his name is Gutierrez, who really charged in, escalated in almost every way possible, and really put the lieutenant in a situation where I think it confirmed, that behavior confirmed to him what his initial fears were and why he sought a safe, well-lit place and put his hands out the window. And again, this is a situation where, as you pointed out, I believe that Lieutenant Nazario, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, I believe he had just purchased this car and had temporary tags posted in the front windshield and in the back window. And I believe also that at least what's been reported is when he arrived into the well-lit area, it was visible. The tags were visible, so the officers shouldn't have had the kind of ratcheting up of the stop.
I'm running out of time, Sean. I hate to cut you off, but quickly, I do want to note that second officer did have his gun drawn, so he may have been more calm in terms of his words, but he also was standing on the side of that vehicle with a gun. You can see it in that photograph. Bernarda, before I let you go, any charges can you see as a prosecutor working in the DA's office? Any charges that you see can be filed against both of these officers, who, in my opinion, were out of control?
Mm-hmm. So, Areva, at this point, the charges that I see that may be filed against both of these officers are disciplinary charges as a result of them being police officers. At this point, I do not see any criminal charges. I think more of an investigation has to take place because we're not privy to everything that happened. However, land of the free, home of the brave, the lieutenant serving his country, and this is how he is treated. And this is exactly why people kneel during these games. These are exactly why people are scared when officers stop them. This is exactly why people run away when officers try to approach them. That's the fear that we live in this country, land of the free, home of the brave, but not for us.
I think it's called driving while black. One thing, on a positive note, at least the captain of this lieutenant said he was very proud of him. We know that officer that was, spraying the pepper spray has since been relieved of his job. Sadly, though, none of this really happened until this videotape was revealed. This is an incident that happened back in December, so we should be clear about it. So the actions that have been taken now are as a result of the video coming out. So much more, obviously, to talk about on these issues. I'm running out of time, but I do want to thank you, Sean and Bernarda, for helping us understand what's happening with these two really horrific cases that just demonstrate the structural racism and intrinsic problem that this country has around policing African Americans. Again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Areva.
Got to move on to my next guest. Excited to have with me, joining me this morning is Dr. Tracie Keesee. She is the co-founder of Center for Police Equity, and Nekima Levy Armstrong, who was on the show a couple of weeks ago. She's a civil rights attorney, an activist, the former NAACP director in Minneapolis, and she's the executive director of the Wayfinder Foundation. And Nekima's on the ground in Minneapolis. Tell us, Nekima, what's going on there? We've seen the news reports about protests that have been taking place over the last 3 days over the shooting death of Dante Wright. What's the mood of the city right now?
There's a great deal of tension here. We're in Brooklyn Center, which is about 10 minutes or so from Minneapolis. And folks are standing out here protesting in front of the Brooklyn Center Police Department. We've been out here since Sunday, essentially. And what we are seeing is an increased militarized police presence. It's not the Brooklyn Center Police tonight, but it is the Hennepin County Sheriff's Office. It is the Minnesota Department of Public Safety. It is the National Guard. And all of these entities are heavily armed. Last night, they arrested over 50 people who are still detained right now on a 36-hour hold for probable cause rioting charges. And I went to the jail today to help provide jail support through the National Lawyers Guild. And what we have found was many of those individuals were really just standing there outside of the police station, and they have been treated very aggressively. And now they're in holding cells simply for standing up for justice for Dante Wright.
Yeah, so as not to confuse my audience, we are taping this segment on Wednesday. It's going to air on Friday. So by Friday, we'll be looking to see, how many days the protests would have continued throughout this week. I do want to ask you, Nekima, about the charges that were announced this week by that county district attorney that has taken over the case. I guess at this point, your attorney general has declined, taking the case, believing that this local county district attorney can handle this matter. What do you think about the second-degree manslaughter? Is that going to satisfy the community on the ground in Minneapolis, the suburb outside of Minneapolis?
Absolutely not. And if it weren't for the community activists and organizers showing up in Brooklyn Center right after Daunte Wright was killed, as his body lay in the street for 5 hours, and then showing up at the Brooklyn Center Police Department, and then showing up at Brooklyn Center City Hall on Monday morning, there never would have been any charges. But we had to demand that the county manager be fired, which he was, that the police chief would be fired, which they allowed him to resign before he was fired, and that Kim Potter be fired, which she was allowed so far to resign, although we've asked the mayor to not accept that resignation and to fire her, and then we demanded charges. We want to see second-degree murder charges, third-degree murder charges, and manslaughter charges. Now, there was a recent case that happened here. The first officer to ever be convicted for killing a civilian, Officer Muhammad Noor, a Black Muslim Somali man who was part of the Minneapolis Police Department, killed Justine Rusacek Damon, a white woman. He was charged with third-degree murder, and he was convicted. Now, the state had to manipulate the statute in order to make a third-degree murder charge fit for Muhammad Noor. He was convicted and sentenced to 12 and a half years in prison, which he is serving right now. And the circumstances of this case are not all that different from what happened with earlier charges against Muhammad Noor.
Let me help us understand what happened with those terminations. So we know that this Brooklyn Center has this young African-American mayor, and I saw the city manager. He was an African-American male as well, right? Why was he fired, the manager?
He was fired for doing the absolute most. And what I mean by that is that he had been the city manager for over 2 decades. He thought he was running the city. And through their city charter, the city manager actually has authority over the police department. Mm-hmm. And so when we were out there protesting on Sunday night, which is the night that Daunte was killed, the police at that time turned off all the lights outside of the police station, and they began to tear gas us. They used rubber bullets and flashbang grenades. They injured many people. And the fact that the lights were out meant that they couldn't even see who they were targeting. So anyone who was out there was subjected to the use of excessive force on the part of the police. And so the next morning, we showed up at City Hall. We met with the mayor, we met with the city manager and the police chief, and we laid down the law in terms of our expectations of these people being fired for what they have done.
So the reason just to be clear, the gripe with the city manager, obviously his history of running the city, but specifically around turning those lights off? Was that
it was turning the lights off, but it was authorizing excessive force
by the police
against peaceful protesters.
Okay, and I saw the police.
Acceptable. And when we had the press conference, they had a press conference that morning. We were present. So if anybody listened to the press conference, they could hear activists asking questions. And I specifically asked the city manager for the name of the officer to be released. And he said she deserves due process. And I said, Daunte Wright didn't receive due process. You're trying to protect a killer cop. So his whole attitude, unfortunately, was really arrogant. He was defensive. He was supportive of those excessive force tactics being used against protesters. And we said, it's time for you to go. And I think we have to understand that, yes, there are people who are African-American in positions of power, but they can also be part of the problem if they are leaning more towards the system and not justice. And that's why he had to go.
Yeah, I watched that press conference, and I knew the chief wasn't going to last. When he walked out, when he walked away from the press conference, when he stood there so defiantly defending the officer without having all the facts, when he kept, using the word accident, was just seemed angry himself that he was even being asked questions. So I wasn't surprised to see his departure shortly thereafter. Let me bring you in, Dr. Keesee. You work with an agency that believes that this bias that we see in policing, this anti-Black bias, that it can be solved. Help us understand, because from all of these incidents, it looks like it's getting worse rather than getting better.
So I want to make sure we be clear about, what does it mean to solve something, right? So if we could solve racism, we would be solving a whole lot of issues here. And so for us and for what we do at CPE, it's not just, we know these biases exist. We know that people are constantly trying to figure out ways to mitigate or to move around them. The question is, what's the permanent solution here? And part of that means that you have to go in and look at, for example, who are you hiring? What is the role of the folks you're asking, to hire, and what work are you asking them to do? So, but it's not just that too. It's the policies, it's the structures, all the things that you've been talking about over the last half hour that have been designed and created to respond and act in the way in which they're doing. They were not designed for people of color. They were designed to do exactly what you see happening. And so part of that work is, how do you get people to begin to move not just away from these resolutions, but they believe, again, the excessive use of force, authorizing that when you're actually going out and trying to protect your own constitutional rights. How do you get folks to understand that these outcomes are disproportionately impacting Black and brown people, and that you have to believe that people here in human form are doing exactly what you said they should be doing, and that is exercising their rights, the rights to drive, the rights to walk, the rights to protest. And so part of that work begins, how do you start to help folks understand you've got to start looking at body-worn camera policies, right? So not releasing names, not releasing videos, all of those things play into this. But do we have a resolution for racism? We don't, but we do know what needs to start happening here in order to begin to reducing some of the harm, not eliminating it. And this is not harm reduction. This is, what do we do till we get to where we need to be? And that is a lot of the work in which we take.
Yeah, I've been so many jobs I have, but one of them is I'm a commentator for CNN and HLN, and I've been doing trial coverage on the Derek Chauvin trial every day. And we were thinking, we being media collectively thinking, something may happen in this community if this trial, if somehow there's a hung jury or there's an acquittal, God forbid. No one was expecting this shooting death of another African-American male to happen in the midst of this trial. And it just, for me, reminds me that even when we prosecute one officer, there's another officer waiting to be prosecuted, and we can't prosecute our way out of this. I mean, we can have a trial every week of a rogue cop, but it won't change the policing of Black folks in this country. So I ask you, Nekima, you've been the president of NAACP, oldest civil rights organization in the country. What do you see, or what do the organizations that you work with see as how we deal with this? There are 18,000 police departments across this country, all with their own policies, procedures, cultures. And as soon as we think we've done something, like we were really feeling good, we got Derek Chauvin on second degree and third degree. We got him in a trial. We got, 38 prosecution witnesses. We're feeling pretty good. And then this happens. And it's just a body blow for, the community, for people of color. And
I think that you all might have been feeling pretty good. We weren't here in Minnesota, because we know the kind of system that we're under, the level of oppression. Dr. Tracie knows, she and I know each other from her coming here many years ago and advocating for changes within these systems. And so it is not a surprise to us. We prophesied this. We warned our government that this was going to happen in terms of the uprising that's going on if they didn't rein in our police forces. So I think prosecuting one officer, of course, will not lead to systemic changes or reforms. And the reality is that this is the first white officer in the history of the state of Minnesota who has ever been charged with killing a Black person. I'm talking about Derek Chauvin. I would guarantee you that if officers were charged on a more regular basis, you would start to see a significant decline in the use of deadly force. But we haven't even tried that experiment yet. Most of the time when officers are charged, it is an anomaly in that particular jurisdiction, a once-in-a-lifetime event that everybody gets excited about, but it doesn't lead to a shift in culture. Part of that culture means looking at their hiring practices and policies. Right now, most of the people that they hire are white men who lack cultural competency, who have no inkling about anti-racism, who are very authoritative and aggressive, who need ongoing psychological examinations, who need to be held accountable when they show that they can't follow the laws and when they can't treat people with dignity and respect. But they're never disciplined. They're given a slap on the wrist or no warnings whatsoever when they engage in misconduct. And we need to believe Black people. Black people have been talking about these issues since policing was an institution.
Yeah.
And yet our voices are not heard. Black witnesses are not taken seriously, or they're demonized, as we've seen happen throughout the Derek Chauvin trial, where bystanders are being treated inappropriately for simply trying to intervene and save a man's life. So I don't think that we've done enough. I think we've barely scratched the surface in terms of what needs to be done to transform and overhaul policing in the state of Minnesota and across the nation. And we are not surprised that another police shooting happened, because in December, Minneapolis police killed a Black Somali man named Dolal Eid under very questionable circumstances, riddling his body with bullets at a gas station. And that was 6 months after George Floyd was killed. And there's been no accountability for those officers.
Yeah, I want to ask you, Dr. Keesee, about, a lot of folks say it's time for the police departments to go. That police departments, as we know them, should be abolished. Some use the word defund. Some use more politically correct words and use, transformed. Where does your organization stand in terms of that debate?
So where we stand is don't stand in the way of what needs to happen for communities, and communities get to determine what that safety looks like. So, for example, in the work that we're doing in Ithaca, community had to be centered in driving that work. How do they define safety? What do they see is going to be appropriate? And a lot of times it doesn't mean police officers are there, that you don't need an armed response when you have a mental health crisis, that if you need someone that needs housing, it doesn't require a police officer to show up. And so it really is looking at where do you need and how do you define public safety? And you asking folks to say, well, what happens if you remove all the armed officers? And the questions that you get, and this is generationally, and Nekima she's been a part of these conversations, where you have folks in the community saying, no, we want the police. The question is, what kind of police do you want? And if you don't want the police, what do you want instead? And what we're hearing communities say is, we don't need police officers to show up for mental health calls. We need clinicians. We need folks who understand, people who are from the community. When we have someone that is in a health crisis, you don't send an officer to do surgery. So why would you think that this is going to be appropriate? So it is asking not just those questions, but there are other ways that this can be done. And those are the questions we're asking. What does this look like? And I think the biggest part of all of this is, where do you invest? Right? Because what we're talking about is a lack of investment in the Black community for centuries. Yeah. Right. So we can talk about redlining. We can talk about not having jobs. We can talk about all the underlying causes of what we are seeing come to bear here, and not addressing those in a way in which should be addressed. And so the work that we're doing is exactly that. Invest in the community. When you don't need an armed response, you don't need an armed response. What does that look like? Let the community help you design, or even design, because we have folks already on the ground doing this work that have been doing this work for decades. We have violence disruptors. We've got Nekima who've been doing all of this work, and it's not to come in and fly in and take over what people are doing. It is invest in them, invest in their work. And that's what has to happen. And that's what we...
Yeah, talking about, needing police armed responses, probably don't need an armed response to tell someone their tags have expired and they need to get down to the courthouse or get down to the DMV and renew their tags. That's probably a really good place to start in terms of reallocating our resources. I'm out of time. Nekima, keep us posted on what's happening on the ground. Yeah, this trial, this Derek Chauvin trial, so much. The level of disrespect that those officers showed Mr. Floyd, even before the 9-minute, 29-second restraint, is just startling. And, I don't know how you train someone to tap on the window and say, hey, sir, can you roll your window down? I need to ask you a question, versus put your effing hands up. Just the way that he wasn't even treated, with just basic common decency, humanity, and respect. It's just so appalling. And to see that, then to turn around and see the same conduct by those officers in Windsor, Virginia. So, validates this is an isolated incident. This is the way police respond, when they see people of color. And now we're capturing it on video. It's been happening. It's not new, but now we get to see it played out, on the nightly news. Thanks so much for the work that both of you are doing, raising awareness. Nekima, you're on the grounds there, getting folks fired, getting, folks indicted and charged. And that's what needs to happen. And it's happening in communities around this country. So again, thanks to both of you for the tremendous advocacy on these really, really important issues. Stay safe out there, Nekima. And thank you, Dr. Keesee, for joining me this morning. All right, my next guest, oh man, this is my friend. She's become my friend because I've had her on the show so many times talking about the tragic loss of her son. His name is Oscar Grant. You've heard about him. His name has been brought up so many times with respect to the shooting of Daunte Wright, because her son was shot and killed by transit police in 2009 in Oakland, and that officer used the same excuse that he thought he was, using a taser when he actually used a gun. Her son was face down on the pavement. So again, how you make that kind of mistake is beyond us. And that officer was only charged with involuntary manslaughter, not even manslaughter. So Wanda Johnson is back to talk to us about her son and what this Daunte Wright case means for her and her family. And also here to talk about the trauma, because we are experiencing trauma beyond anything I think we've experienced in a long time in this country. And it's Dr. Earl Turner. He's a psychologist and founder of Therapy for Black Kids. He's also the author of Mental Health Among African Americans. He's returning to the show again. Welcome back, Wanda. Welcome, Dr. Turner. Thank you so much. Wanda, of course, your son's name, is brought up pretty much in every sentence when anyone, experts, media, talking about Daunte Wright, because it harkens back to that, horrible, horrible shooting of your son, Oscar. So tell me just, what did you think when you got the news, saw the news about poor Mr. Wright?
Oh, again, my heart, thank you for having me on the show today. And, my heart goes out to their family, because it's almost like happening again for me. The way it has been playing out, it has been the exact way that it played out when my son Oscar was killed. The officer resigned when Oscar was killed. The officer has resigned for Daunte. The chief, Bart, at that time, he resigned after he basically said almost the same thing as this chief said. And then this chief resigned. And then the demonization has already started. The same role plays that happened with Oscar is happening with this young man. The difference for Oscar was, and Oscar last picture on his cell phone was of the officer who shot and killed him having his taser out, pointing it at him. And then 10 seconds later, he forgets what side his taser was on and shoots and kills my son. I don't believe it for one bit. This young man, these officers, after Oscar was killed, had went through training again with taser gun confusion. This training was worldwide, with getting them to be able to know what side their taser was on versus what side their gun is on, versus the difference between a taser and a gun, versus the difference between one being locked and one unlocked, and then not even knowing. it just baffles me to be down this road again to someone saying they didn't know. Basically, they thought they had their taser. And so it's so heartbreaking to me because we're in the midst of what's going on with George Floyd. And now another young man who lost his life, just beginning a life, really. Look how young he was, will not even have the opportunity to grow up with his child the same way my son didn't have that opportunity.
It's really just, Dr. Turner, I don't even know. I mean, like I said, in my day job, I watch the trial of Derek Chauvin all day, and I provide legal analysis. I try to help people understand it. But as a Black woman, as a mother, this is just like beyond overwhelming. And I'm fortunate. I'm not like Wanda, who's so courageous. I haven't lost a child, but I feel like I've lost a child because I feel like these are my kids too. And I think every Black mother watching these cases play out feels that way. And Dante called his mama, and in the Chauvin trial, what we know is that George Floyd was calling out to his mama. So we know Black men and their mamas, it's a special relationship. Just help us understand what mothers are going through as they watch all this being played out.
Yeah, absolutely. First, thank you for having me back again to talk about this topic, and condolences to the family of Dante. These are situations, as was just discussed by Reverend Johnson, that are tough. We continue to see these experiences where officers are acting negligently and they're not being held accountable, and that adds to the trauma and the stress and all of this sort of repeated negative emotional reaction that we have every time these incidents occur within our communities. And I think that for mothers that lose their sons, that's extremely difficult, because oftentimes as people talk about, that's a really important relationship that mothers have with their son that's unique. And so when that relationship is lost, it takes a huge toll. And so I, as you mentioned, can't understand what that's like for mothers to sort of go through that experience.
Yeah, Dr. Turner, we know in the case of that Army lieutenant, he said he drove about a mile out of that dark area of Windsor, Virginia, to get to a place, excuse me, where there was more light, because he was afraid. A lot of Black people are afraid right now. What do you say to anyone who's driving a car and feels like that could be them, pulled over, routine traffic stop, and have it escalate within seconds to where guns are pulled, tasers are pulled, and lives are lost?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as I was preparing for this, I was trying to emotionally gather myself, because I was in a situation several weeks ago here in Los Angeles where I was on a Zoom call in my car, and a police officer just pulled up out of nowhere and just sat and watched me for a couple of seconds, and then I decided to calmly drive away. Thankfully, nothing escalated, but I think it's unfortunate that in those situations, as a Black person, you are held up to the responsibility to remain calm as opposed to the officer. And so my only advice that I can offer people is try to remain as calm as possible. It's frustrating, it's demeaning to have to go through those experiences where you have to sort of remain calm in a frustration where your automatic biological reaction is to respond emotionally and to be upset, but you can't do that in those situations. So I think that's the other piece that really dysregulates our body in those situations, because we are trying to control things that are not automatic for us to do in situations where we are perceiving threats.
Yeah, Wanda, I want to ask you too about the protest. So we saw a worldwide protest after George Floyd was killed back in May of 2020. We've seen nights of protest in Minneapolis now around Dante. I know there was, protests in Oakland, California, and throughout the country really when your son was killed. Oftentimes the protesters, though, get painted in such a negative light. We heard Nekima say that in this suburb outside of Minneapolis, they were tear gassed, rubber bullets were shot at them, 50 people were arrested. Are you shocked to see that 11 years later, the police are still treating protesters in the same way we saw them treat protesters 10, 11 years ago after your son was murdered?
You know, Areva, I really had to go back to the inception of policing. And as I was looking and studying it and looking at how the inception during slavery that was occurring was police would do basically what they're doing right now to bring that slave owner that slave back to the owner. And I look at how our people really are crying out for help. And we've been crying for help for years. And many of us now are witnessing these kind of incidents where our people are losing their lives, and we're not getting the treatment, we're not getting the counseling, we're not getting anything to help heal that hurt that we're facing. And an officer can walk into a psychiatrist office and get the help that they need to overcome these things, right? We don't get that help. We don't get the financial help that is needed when you lose a loved one. Now this family has to put together money to bury their loved one senselessly. And oftentimes the families sometimes don't have that. They're not buying insurance a lot of times as the child gets older. And then we wonder, oh, these people are out here yelling and hollering and protesting and getting arrested. But look at what happened at the White House. You know, those people was able to get in a guarded place that's not public like these streets. They was able to go in offices and tear up things, and yet these people on the streets are crying out here because our loved ones are being killed at the hands of those who are here to protect or serve the communities. But yet when they see a person of color, they always say fear for their life and then take their life. And then you want to say, oh, these people are out here protesting, tearing up stuff. Well, they're out here tearing up things because you're not understanding that a life has been taken and there's no regard for the African American and brown life, but you will be and pay more attention to the building getting burned, and you'll talk about that more than the one who lost their life. And so, you know, when Oscar was killed and the protest went forth, you know, at first I was like, you guys, don't tear up people's stuff. But then as the years have gone by, this is the only time our people, not our people, but this is the only time the states begin to talk about it and begin to look at it when things are tore up. You know, do I say I agree with that? I'm not going to say that, but I'm saying that if it's where people will begin to understand that Black lives matter, and because Black lives matter, and you're not paying attention to that, and you're allowing us to be killed at a higher rate than a building getting destroyed, is no comparison. You know, I always think about Mike Vick went to jail for the dogs, right? Oscar's killer only did 11 months in county jail. Michael Vick went to prison. How do you even compare that? And so people are in the streets crying out for justice for our people because we're not receiving the justice that we so deserve and are due. You know, and you look at it and you look at the Black man who did the white lady. He's in prison today. He got time, but we're not allowing, or people of other nationalities are not being charged and going to prisons for their actions of killing us because our lives are devalued as if we are not valuable people when we are kings and queens.
Yeah, I just want, so well said, Wanda. One last question for you. Have you watched the Daunte Wright video? And how can you watch it? What does it do for you to watch that video?
I did watch it, and it brings back so many feelings of unnecessary. I truly believe that was a racial profile stop. I believe if it was another nationality, they may have stopped the person, or they probably would not even have stopped the person. But to talk about expired tags and hanging fragrance from your mirror and you being stopped from that, or freshener from your mirror and you getting stopped for that and losing your life. Again, what is the value of the African American and brown life? What is the value of our lives? And we see that our lives are not being valuable because of what happened with Dante. I looked at the video and I saw how he was being treated. And I saw him also, the fear that he felt to try to get away, and still lost his life and died. That's.
I'm sorry, Wanda, I'm running out of time. I just want to ask Dr. Turner to give us 20 seconds. Give us some hope. I got to end this show with something positive. Wanda has, poured her heart out about, the tragedy that has happened, how families feel, how she feels watching that video. Leave us with a little hope, Dr. Turner. I got 20 seconds.
I'm hoping that we continue to advocate for these. We will see change in the system. I'm working with the American Psychological Association as part of a task force against police use of force. And so I'm hoping that organizations like that at the global level can really get into these systems to make sure that they're training officers to respect humanity.
Yeah, we got to leave it there. Thank you so much, Wanda. Always a pleasure to see you. Your strength is awe-inspiring. Your courage is inspiring. Thank you, Dr. Turner, for sharing. Thank you for being a part of that, effort. And I'll leave you with a piece of good news. The CDC is finally recognizing, as I'm sure you know, Dr. Turner, that racism is a public health crisis, long overdue. But, not too late to acknowledge it. And hopefully what that acknowledgement means is drive some of those resources that you're talking about, Wanda, so people can get the mental health counseling, can get the support, can get the medical help that they need to, really survive what has clearly become one of the most traumatic 11 months. You combine the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, with the pandemic of racism in this country, and we've been hit hard as a community. But thanks to voices like yours, I'm hopeful we're going to get to the other side of this. Again, thank you so much, both of you, for joining me this morning. Wow, these shows are always really, really difficult for me. My family always checks in to see if I'm consuming too much news and watching too many videos. And, for my family that's watching, I'm okay. I'm good. I'm good because I have the privilege and the honor to talk to folks like Wanda and Dr. Turner and Nekima and my guest this morning, because they are, this is a village project. It takes everybody in the village to get through this. I want to thank my guests for joining me. Thank them for their voices. Thanks to all of you for your comments, for your questions, for your activism and your advocacy. It really does matter. Just some simple words to live by before I get out. And I'm asking the question, when will Black lives really matter? And I mean beyond a slogan, beyond an Instagram post, beyond a press release, even beyond protesting. When do we start to see the kind of systemic dismantling of the racial structures and barriers that cause us to keep having to offer thoughts and prayers to families like Wanda Johnson's, to families like Michael Brown, to families like Tamir Rice and Trayvon Martin, and now Dante Wright, to George Floyd, to Breonna Taylor. The list goes on and on. I can literally take an hour and list all the African Americans, unarmed men and women, that have lost their lives to police violence. But rather than do that, I'll do what Dr. Turner suggested we do, which is, find some hope, find some bright spot in all of this. And for me, that bright spot is knowing that there are activists and advocates who aren't going to get up or let up. They're not. They're going to stay on this because this has to change, and it has to change now. And each and every one of us has a role to play in that change. So I'm asking, when will Black lives really matter? And a part of that answer has to do with each and every one of us. What are we going to do to make sure that Black lives do really matter? I'm out, y'all. Be safe out there. Don't forget to wear your mask. And remember, we are all in this together.